Well, it's great to be back with you.
Yeah.
We've been planning this talk on Plato for a really long time, and it's a difficult subject to approach. I've written 2 essays that are relevant to it, which I want to reference right up front, because as deep as we may go here, it's still only going to be scratching the surface compared to the complexity of what I've written in these essays. And the most important of them is called The Pharmakon Artist in Lovers of Sophia. So I believe it's the second essay in this book. This book, Lovers of Sophia, it's an anthology. It's a collection of essays rather than really being a book. And these essays were actually written before Prometheus and Atlas. I think almost every piece in Lovers of Sophia preceded Prometheus and Atlas, in some cases significantly. And frankly, I have to confess that Pharmakon Artist is the oldest of them. So in that essay on Plato, you see, which is fitting because, as I quote Alfred North Whitehead at the beginning of this essay, some people have taken the view that the whole history of Western philosophy consists of a series of footnotes to Plato. That's how Whitehead put it. And so I suppose it's fitting that my own first philosophical work was my interpretation of Plato, which is an essay of almost book length. It could be a short book. And I wrote it in my 20s. And in a lot of ways, this essay, The Pharmakon Artist, can be seen as an esoteric key to my entire corpus. And by the end of our conversation, maybe I'm going to highlight a few ways in which that's the case. So that essay in Lovers of Sophia, and then there is a chapter in Prometheus and Atlas toward the end. I believe it is chapter 9 of Prometheus and Atlas. Atlas of the New Atlantis deals with Plato's quote myth unquote of Atlantis, and we'll get into that as well here because I think it's very relevant to understanding what we could call Plato's unwritten doctrine, or esoteric Plato. His knowledge concerning Atlantis is very relevant to that subject, and in that chapter, Atlas of the New Atlantis, I get into Plato's understanding of Atlantis and how it's related to the way in which he wanted to transform Greek society. So anyway, those are the 2 references that I wanted to give up front. And I mean, do you have any prefatory remarks you'd like to make before we jump in?
Yeah. I just want to lay this out for people that we didn't plan this out as a series to begin with, but it's materializing as one now. So we started off our discussion. This is going to be a 4-part playlist on my channel for people who are watching. It's okay if this is the first video you stumbled on. You can watch this one first. You can watch them in any order, but I would prefer to start off with the Mithra video, because Mithra is such an ancient idea that has its tentacles in the Vedic world as well as the Western world. And then, so that was our first video. We introduced that. And then we went into Zoroaster. And Zoroaster, coming out of the Mithraic tradition, revolutionizes religion, theology, philosophy for the entire Western world. And so then after that video, we did Prometheism. And why that's so important to come third is because the Prometheism video really shows that there's a divide in the world between people who are submitting to this idea of a tyrant god, the El cults, the Judeo-Christian religions, versus the Promethean religions of divine knowledge that will make that you self become like the gods. So there's this idea of the two, and now we're getting into Plato. And so Plato is going to be the end of all of this, but also the beginning of something else. And so if you want, based on what I just said, tell us why this is so important to have Plato at the end of this.
I don't want to go on about Iran again, and continue to give people the impression that I'm some kind of Persian chauvinist. But there are a few points that could be made with relation to these other conversations of ours that you referenced. And one is that, of course, Plato was a member of the Pythagorean order. After the death of Socrates, Plato went to Italy and joined the Pythagorean order. And, of course, Pythagoras himself had studied at length in Egypt. And so Plato kind of followed Pythagoras's footsteps and then studied in Egypt for a while, tracing, some Pythagorean ideas to their source in ancient Egyptian wisdom. But as we've discussed in our previous conversations, Pythagoras also studied for over a decade in the capital of the Persian Empire. He was brought back to the capital of Iran by Cambyses II, the son of Cyrus the Great, and he studied with the Magi in Babylon, the administrative capital of, Achaemenid Iran. And so, and by the way, Pythagoras only left Iran when the Persians conquered Samos. He was from Samos. And so he only goes home once his homeland, his island, becomes part of the Persian Empire. And there's some evidence to suggest that basically he was kind of sent on a mission by the Magi, and that his founding of the Pythagorean order in Sicily is an extension of sort of the Magian order of Babylon and so forth. And so here you have one of Plato's sources of wisdom, namely the Pythagorean order, having been fundamentally shaped by Mithraic Zoroastrian thought. And then Plato, as we're going to get into in this conversation, very significantly, Plato's, I don't know if you want to say second most important source of influence, whatever, another major influence on him was the school of Heraclitus. And in fact, let me reference this right here, okay? Aristotle tells us that Plato in his youth, presumably after the death of Socrates, Socrates died when Plato was still quite young, but presumably immediately after the death of Socrates, Plato became a Heraclitean, and specifically he studied with this Heraclitean teacher, Cratylus, okay? Cratylus, who was a thinker in the school of Heraclitus. And actually, we just want to take the time for a moment to read this quote here because it's very significant to the argument that I want to lay out about Plato's unwritten doctrine. One is where Aristotle tells us in his Metaphysics, quote, "For as a young man, Plato was originally an associate of Cratylus and Heraclitean opinions to the effect that all perceptible things were in a permanent state of flux and that there was no knowledge of them, and these things he also later on maintained," unquote. Then there's another remark regarding this from Aristotle, also in his Metaphysics, where Aristotle, and by the way, for those who are not familiar, Aristotle was Plato's student, okay? Actually, Aristotle was Plato's greatest student, even though Plato did not choose him to head the academy after his death. So, Aristotle is a fairly good, witness and source of testimony regarding the developmental trajectory of Plato's thought. And the other thing he tells us in Metaphysics concerning the Heraclitean background of Plato's philosophy is this, quote, "Now the starting point for those who came up with the theory of forms was a conviction of the truth of the Heraclitean considerations to the effect that all perceptible objects are in a permanent state of flux, so that a condition on the very possibility of knowledge and understanding was the existence, in addition to the perceptible ones, of certain other natural entities which are not in a state of flux, on the assumption that entities in flux were not possible objects of knowledge," unquote. Okay, so this is what Aristotle tells us about, and then there's one other remark that's specifically about Plato's Heraclitean teacher, Cratylus. So this is Aristotle commenting on Plato's teacher from the school of Heraclitus. Quote, "They," meaning the Heracliteans, "observed that all nature around us undergoes change and held that one cannot speak the truth about that which is undergoing change. So a fortiori, nothing true could be said about what was changing at all points in all ways. This is the position of those who appropriated the legacy of Heraclitus, notably of Cratylus, His mature position was that speech of any kind was radically inappropriate and that expression should be restricted exclusively to the movement of the finger. He was appalled that Heraclitus had claimed that you could not step twice into the same river. In his, Cratylus's opinion, it was already going too far to admit stepping into the same river once. So that was, well, I presented that as a kind of aside, but it's going to become key to the argument that I want to make. But I took the time to just, put those quotes out there because Heraclitus was invited by Darius the Great, the emperor of the Persian Empire, to be the court philosopher of Iran.
Wow.
So, okay, so look, in a country where you have all these magi who are the bearers of the legacy of Zarathustra, Darius doesn't choose one of his fellow Iranian magi to be the court philosopher of the Persian Empire. He invites this Greek from Ephesus to come to the Persian court. Now, of course, Heraclitus refuses, and instead he exiles himself to the temple of Artemis in Ephesus, never leaves other than to come out onto the temple steps and play games with children whose parents are, visiting to basically worship the goddess. But Artemis, the goddess whose temple Heraclitus sequesters himself to, is also originally an Iranian goddess, specifically worshipped by the Sarmatians. So Heraclitus is very clearly in the Iranian orbit spiritually. And so now we have a second major influence on Plato who's steeped in Iranian thought, Heraclitus.
Let me just jump in for 1 second. Artemis has the subtitle, her name, her nickname, Luciferia. She is like the female aspect of Lucifer. So you have this, when we talked about this in Prometheism, this idea of the opposing viewpoint of these two different views on what God is, or which God we should give our devotion to. And so here we are with this court with a goddess whose subtitle's name is Luciferia, and that's from Callimachus. I can show the sources if you guys want.
I'll add something esoteric that makes this even more striking. So the name Artemis, contrary to what some linguists have argued, doesn't really mean anything in Greek, but it means a hell of a lot in the original Old Iranian, and that's Arta Amesha. Arta Amesha means immortal truth. Arta meant truth in the sense of like logos, wow, cosmic order. And so it's the undying cosmic order, which, by the way, was symbolized by fire. Heraclitus, fire becomes, the metaphor for cosmic energy in his thinking. Arta Amesha means immortal truth in Old Iranian. And it's a, what do you call it? They say sefat in Persian. It's a quality. It's an epithet. Okay, it's a descriptor. But the actual name of the deity that was worshipped by the Sarmatians, who is described as Arta Amesha or immortal truth, was Satana or Shatana.
Wow.
Okay, so I've always thought that, look, I mean, this culture, the Scythians invaded. The Scythians and Sarmatians are kindred cultures. In some cases, they're almost indistinguishable from one another, and they invaded the Middle East by at least 700 BC, and we know they got as far as the border of Palestine with Egypt, okay, or the border of Israel with Egypt. And so I've always thought that this reference ha-shaitan in Hebrew actually is coming from the name of Shatana and was a demonization of this serpentine goddess figure of the Sarmatians, who had, serpents entwined around her, and who was served by the Gorgons. The Gorgons were sort of goddess figures associated with this great goddess. And so in any case, there's a lot there, behind Artemis and the figure that, of course, Heraclitus decided to devote himself to, or rather, at least take refuge in the sanctum of her temple, rather than accepting the invitation of Darius the Great. Anyway, we went on a tangent. My point was that Plato is influenced by at least two figures who are steeped in Iranian thinking, Pythagoras and Heraclitus.